So we've done f of omega naught plus 1. We noted that we have gotten just past Graham's number in size. And like I said, it's not super hard to guess what's next. We'll just put two successor markers on omega naught. And we'll call that omega naught plus 2. Just really a formal symbol. And we don't really need to know too much yet about how to manipulate those guys. We'll start doing intense arithmetic on these guys eventually, but we'll really kind of just develop it as we go. And so we define f of this control argument, omega naught plus 2, acting on input n, to be just iterate the previous one n times on n. It's exactly the same definition. So this is always going to be, whenever I put an extra successor marker or add 1 to the control argument, it's going to be repeat the previous one n times on n. That's always the definition. Okay. So f of omega naught plus 2 on 2, say. Let's not do 1 because that just degenerates again. Okay, what's going on here? We're going to take the f omega naught plus 1 function, going to apply it a measly 2 times. So it's not going to be using the full power of iteration yet. So that's just expanded out. Just apply it to 2, which we actually know the answer to, or we have another way to say the answer. And then we're going to put it into the f omega naught plus 1 function. Okay, so that's f8 of 8. Again, something you can go back to and kind of say, yeah, what way do I really understand how big that number is? I mean, it's already incredibly big by any ordinary standards. So it's important that it's big, for sure. But we're going to produce something that's much bigger in just a second, because we're going to put it into the f omega naught plus 1 function. And what does that do? Okay, remember that iterates the very flexible, powerful diagonalization activating f omega naught function f of 8 times. Okay, that's that's definitely way bigger than Graham's number. Because what we're doing, we have this very large number, something that you can't even imagine in terms of like how many zeros is it, or is it bigger than a googolplex? It's so much bigger than a googolplex. It's ridiculous. We have that appearing as the iteration exponent of this function, that the best thing ever to do with this function is to iterate it, because we get this kind of crazy binary expansion. So if we look at this, what happened before here, right, way back here, right, we had f of 3 turned into f of 3 f of 3 inside an f, turned into f of 3 f of 3 f of 3, and every time you double, we saw with 4, you do that 3 times. You want to think of this, I don't know, bacteria growing or something, or zooming into a fractal perhaps. It's just like doubling, and the complexity is doubling at every stage. And every time, and how many times are we doing that doubling? This unimaginably big number, f of 8, 8. Okay. So, yeah, so like I say here, we could imagine, what if we kind of zoomed in on that? Like imagine writing it all out like this style. Just, it's kind of ridiculous. It wouldn't fit in the universe or any conceivable universe. But you write that out in tiny typeface in something that goes so long, contained in this incredibly big universe, and you zoom out and you just see this one string of little symbols, and you can't even figure out what symbols are. And then just imagine sort of zooming into that until you finally resolve that, oh, it's a bunch of this f88 number. It's a bunch of f of that, and inside f of that, inside of f of that. But and so this I hope this analogy to the fractal zoom clicks with people. But if you think about it, right, those fractal zooms, even the really impressive Mandelbrot zooms that you see on YouTube, they're really impressive. You know, no shade on them, but you might go into like, I don't know, 10 to the 2000 or something is where we go at this point. This is so much bigger, because it's got this scale of, even the scale of how many doublings have been done to create this expression. If you were able to write it out with all those omega naughts evaluated, it's this level of size. That's incredible. Okay, and we're only at f of omega naught plus 2, evaluated at a measly 2. Okay, well, let's go on. As usual with these videos, like in the other series, we kind of let our minds be blown, or I let my mind be blown. It's fun. And then I go on and like, okay, I'm going to pretend I understand that number, and I'm just going to go on to the next one and see just how much bigger it is. Okay, so f of omega naught plus 2 on 3. Now we're going to iterate this very powerful function 3 times with input 3. Okay, so far so good. That's easy to write out. Okay, even this isn't too hard to write out. But this is, I really want to focus on this one because this is a very common feature of what we're going to be doing when this gets really intricate, is that we've got some interesting function which has this sort of flexible power because it has this variable float that gets things get put into it. And then it's iterated a number of times, and even the iteration exponent is a multi-layered gadget. Okay, so one thing we can do just to get the tiniest impression of what's really going on here is let's just actually focus on just what the iteration exponent is. We know that when we take some sort of big iteration exponent, this is going to be explosively growing. And it's the original input is no slouch either. That's a pretty darn big number. That's bigger than anything we've seen before. But what's going to really, part of what's really going to really drive it is, well, how many times are we actually iterating this explosively growing function and recycling outputs to inputs? So it's the barest shadow of how big the actual final number is, but it's very worthwhile concentrating on. Okay, so what is that? That is 2 iterations of omega naught plus 1. So that's very similar to what we did before. That's iterate the basic omega naught function this many times on itself. Okay, now we're going, and here's another kind of zooming into the fractal kind of thing. We're going to zoom into that iteration exponent. So remember, we're only trying to actually analyze the iteration exponent on the actual number. And then to analyze that, that's also an iteration. So let's pause and say, okay, zoom in one more layer and say, well, with the iteration exponent there, okay, that's something we can actually write with no omega naughts, just a bunch of f's and 3's in parentheses. Okay, still, there's a tiny bit of that binary tree action going on. We take f of 3, 3, which that is not ridiculously huge. But then we put that in as the input and the control exponent, or control input, into an f function. So that is ridiculous because this is a big thing to be the label of the f function. Okay, so we're doing that. And then that is the input and the control exponent for a last layer of f. But remember, that is just to control this iteration exponent. Then that gets used as how many times you iterate the beautifully powerful omega naught, which creates huge binary trees of f of blah comma blah, and then that iteration is creating this thing, which is this guy, and then finally that is used as an iteration exponent again on the omega naught. So this is morally like the way that f of 4, was iterate f of 3 many times, and f of 3 was iterate f of 2 many times, and f of 2 was iterate f of 1 many, many times. So it's not morally different because it's the same thing. It's the definition is the successor. When you put a successor in the control argument, it just means iterate the previous guy this many times. But when what you're putting into it is already a number that has to be unpacked as levels of successors and diagonalization, successors and diagonalizations, it really has a super powerful effect. Okay, and so even though it's the same definition technically as how f2 relates to f3, relates to f4, relates to f5, and that's the beauty of it, that you don't need a new kind of definition. The fact that it's involving these previously hugely created numbers makes it pretty amazingly powerful. Let's go a tiny bit further. We can repeat the successor of operation on omega naught arbitrarily many times. So we've got omega naught as our base gadget. That's our first just integer control argument. That successor once, successor twice, successor 3 times, successor as many times as you like. And so this is building out the very start of what we're going to call a new set of gadgets. And you can think of them as a higher order kind of number. They're very closely related to infinite ordinal numbers. that we can call omega 1. For us, that's just the set of the kinds of gadgets we're going to get if we start out with our base omega naught numbers and we allow ourselves to create functions and do successors, and then we'll see we can combine those. Well, you'll see that right in just a second, actually. This is kind of like how we started our story, and that's going to be a very important issue. There we started with the number 0, and we did an arbitrary number of successors. Now we're starting with some new seed of a new world, omega 1 level gadgets, and the first thing we do is, okay, just take a bunch of successors. And in particular, it looks like we're applying a higher level version of f of 0 itself. So this is another kind of, you could say kind of diagonalization, I don't know, recursion argument. I guess it's really recursion. And that we're applying, it seems like, the f idea, the fast growing hierarchy idea, to the gadget, to these new gadgets that were so powerful in the control argument of f. And that will be part of the kind of the final codification of how this can go very, very far. But just a little more about omega 1. So we can create new elements of omega 1, this new world, we're just going to alternate successor tagging and building domains. They're always going to have, for now, they're always going to have domain ordinary natural numbers. So they're going to be sequences, right? And eventually we'll have domains that are omega 1 and then domains that are omega 2. We're not there yet. Okay, so the next gadget that we get here, after we did one use of the function idea, which was the simplest case, just the identity function, and then we did repeated taggings with successors, and we, in principle, can say, oh, we can do that an arbitrary many times. And then we're going to define something that makes sense to be called omega naught times 2. And the 2 always goes on the right-hand side to accommodate sort of how the arithmetic should work when you actually make this a full system of arithmetic. It's very parallel to ordinary infinite ordinal arithmetic, if you know that. Omega naught 2 is a function from omega naught to omega 1, right? So this is just a sequence of gadgets in omega 1, and it's just exactly the sequence I just showed you at the top of the screen. Omega naught 2, and we're going to use this sort of this notation of square brackets k to mean this is a function that takes integers and creates and produces gadgets, and this is the kth, what happens when you give it input k. In other words, at this level, it's just really a sequence. And the sequence is just omega naught plus k. So omega naught plus 1, omega naught plus 2. It just collects and collates all of those omega naught plus integer systematically. And of course, the use for that, the reason we care, is we're going to go in the first slot of f. Like I said, the definition of f some interesting gadget comma n, when this is a function, is exactly the diagonalization story. So that's going to be this new gadget, which just collects together the omega naught plus k's applied on n. By definition, you take that function and you give it the input n. So this is the diagonalization that duplicates something from the slot you intended to put it in. And then, oh my goodness, I didn't realize it was also going to duplicate itself into this other slot, which determines the control argument, which can be much more powerful. And so it's just going to be omega naught plus n comma n. So what's that going to do? I think we'll just show this and then stop this part. So if omega naught 2 comma 1, it's not going to be that exciting, guys. You just take the first thing in that sequence. Oh, that's omega naught plus 1, but you still have an argument 1. If you unwrap it, it just degenerates to 2. Okay. Well, if omega naught 2, 2, it's not going to be mind-blowing, but it is f of omega naught 2, the second entry in that sequence, which is f omega naught plus 2, comma 2. Hey, that is one we did. That's this guy where you repeat the f omega naught function f8 of 8 times. Not shabby. And f omega naught 2 comma 3 is beyond, that's going beyond what we've done before, f omega naught 2, the third entry in that sequence. So it's f omega naught plus 3 comma 3. Now I could have kind of done that more explicitly as well, but I skipped it. But it is take the f omega naught plus 2 function, which we only investigated for very small inputs, and first apply it to 3, and then do it again on that output, and then do it again. And so this was the last one we did with any detail, and it was enormous. And then this says take the f omega naught plus 2 function and apply it to that that number two more times. And we're going to keep going with this. One more, I guess one thing, again, for people who have seen some of this, you might be saying, mention fundamental sequences, mention fundamental sequences. This is tightly related to the notions of ordinary ordinals, infinite ordinals, and ordinary ordinal arithmetic combined with what's called a notion of fundamental sequences. The cool thing about this is we don't need any of that. All we need is the notion of a function and the successor tag, and that gives us all of that stuff. And that's exactly what we need to create these fast-growing functions. So we'll continue in the next part.